She went from an $11 million fortune to robbing a video store for $164. Dana Plato was America's sweetheart on Diff'rent Strokes, but when she grew up, Hollywood threw her away. Betrayed by her accountants and abandoned by the industry, her life became a slow-motion tragedy that claimed not just her, but her son as well. This is the heartbreaking true story of the tragic end of Dana Plato. Dana was born on November 7, 1964, to a terrified, unmarried teenager named Linda Strain. In the social climate of the early 1960s, an unwed mother was a pariah, a source of shame. Linda, young and ill-equipped to raise a child, made the agonizing decision to give her baby up for adoption. She hoped, as all mothers in that position do, that her daughter would find a better life, a life of stability and love. In June 1965, that hope seemed to be realized when the 7-month-old baby was adopted by Dean and Florine Plato. They were a couple who wanted a child desperately, and when they looked at little Dana with her bright eyes and natural radiance, they saw a miracle. But Florine Plato's love for her new daughter was a complex, suffocating force. It was a love born of anxiety, a love that sought to possess and protect to the point of imprisonment. Florine was convinced that the world was a dangerous, dirty place, and that Dana was a porcelain doll who might shatter if exposed to the elements. From the moment Dana entered the Plato household, Florine began to construct what friends and family would later describe as a plastic bubble around the girl. This wasn't just a metaphor. Dana's childhood was fundamentally different from that of her peers. While other children in the San Fernando Valley were scraping their knees on asphalt, climbing trees, and learning the rough and tumble social dynamics of the playground, Dana was kept inside. She wasn't allowed to play in the dirt. She wasn't allowed to have unstructured time. Her diet was strictly monitored to ensure she remained petite and camera-ready. Her social interactions were curated by Florine, who viewed every stranger as a potential threat and every other child as a source of germs or bad influence. It was a childhood defined by the word no. No, you can't go to the sleepover. No, you can't ride your bike to the store. No, you can't join the softball team. The only time Florine said yes, and she said it with enthusiastic, driving ambition, was when a casting director asked if Dana could smile. Florine decided early on that Dana was special, that she was destined for greatness, and that greatness lay in the entertainment industry. By the time she was a toddler, Dana was working. She wasn't building blocks or learning to share. She was learning to hit her marks. She appeared in over 100 commercials before she hit puberty. She was selling breakfast cereal, family toys, and the wholesome image of the perfect American child. This constant exposure to the camera rewired Dana's developing brain. She learned that love and approval were conditional. They were transactional. If she smiled when the director said action, she was praised. If she was the good girl, she was rewarded with Florine's affection. If she was tired or cranky or simply wanted to be a kid, she was a problem to be managed. She learned to suppress her own needs, to mask her own feelings, and to become a mirror that reflected whatever the adults in the room wanted to see. She was developing the skills of a great actress, but she was losing the ability to be a functioning human being. She had no agency. She had no voice. She was a puppet, and the strings were held tight in Florine's anxious grip. However, beneath the layers of conditioning and control, there was a spark of genuine spirit in Dana. There was one place where the plastic bubble couldn't contain her, one place where she felt a sense of freedom and power, the ice rink. Dana was a gifted figure skater. It wasn't just a hobby. She was a serious athlete. On the ice, she wasn't Florine's doll. She was a force of nature. She was fast, she was graceful, and she was fearless. The cold air in her lungs felt like independence. She trained rigorously, dreaming of the Olympics. For a brief, shining moment in her adolescence, it looked like skating might be her ticket out of the Hollywood grind. It was something she did for herself, a talent that relied on her strength and discipline, not just her pretty face. She was training for the Olympic team, finding a sense of self-worth that had nothing to do with a casting director's approval. But the industry is a jealous god, and Florine was its high priestess. In 1977, the producers of a new sitcom in development called Diff'rent Strokes were looking for a girl to play the role of Kimberly Drummond. They had already cast the two boys, Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges, and they needed the perfect foil, a teenage sister who was wealthy but kind, privileged but grounded. They saw hundreds of girls. The audition rooms were packed with the usual Hollywood hopefuls, girls with stage mothers, girls with polished resumes, girls who could tap, dance, and sing. But the casting director, Herb Kenwith, was looking for something elusive. He was looking for a light. When Dana Plato walked into that audition room, the atmosphere changed. She didn't just walk in, she pirouetted. She had a natural, effervescent warmth that couldn't be taught in acting school. She was beautiful, yes, with her wide smile and bright eyes, but there was a vulnerability to her, a sweetness that made you want to protect her. She read the lines and she wasn't just acting. She was Kimberly Drummond. The producers knew instantly. Kenwith later said that Dana lit up the room. She had the X factor, that undefinable quality that makes a star. They offered her the role immediately. It was the role of a lifetime. It was the golden ticket, but it came with a price tag that Dana, at 13 years old, couldn't possibly understand. To accept the role of Kimberly Drummond, she had to give up the one thing that was truly hers. The producers took one look at her figure skating and shook their heads. The risk of injury was too high. You can't film a sitcom if the star has a broken ankle. The insurance companies wouldn't allow it. The schedule wouldn't allow it. Florine agreed. The Olympics were a pipe dream. TV was a paycheck. So the skating had to go. The ice skates were hung up, and with them went Dana's last tether to a normal, self-determined life. She was no longer an athlete. She was an asset. Diff'rent Strokes debuted on NBC in November 1978, and it was a cultural explosion. It wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. The premise, a wealthy white businessman adopting the two black sons of his deceased housekeeper, was a bold social statement for the time, packaged in the palatable format of a family sitcom. It rocketed to the top of the ratings. Suddenly, Dana Plato, Gary Coleman, and Todd Bridges were the most famous children in America. They were everywhere, on talk shows, on magazine covers, on merchandise. They were the Diff'rent Strokes kids, an inseparable trio of innocence and racial harmony. On the sound stage at Metro Media Square in Los Angeles, the three young actors formed a bond that was forged in the fire of extreme fame. They clung to each other because no one else could possibly understand the bizarre pressure cooker they were living in. They were children, but they were also the breadwinners for their families and the linchpins of a multi-million-dollar corporation. They worked long hours, often skirting the edges of child labor laws. They were expected to be professional, to know their lines, to hit their marks, and to be on 24 hours a day. For Dana, the set became a second home, and the cast became a surrogate family. Conrad Bain, who played the father figure Mr. Drummond, and Charlotte Ray, who played the housekeeper Mrs. Garrett, were kind and protective, but the plastic bubble had followed Dana to work. While Gary Coleman was allowed to be precocious and demanding, and Todd Bridges was beginning to explore the edges of rebellion, Dana was expected to be the good girl. She was the moral center of the teenage storylines. She was the one who learned the lesson, who gave the hug, who smiled the reassuring smile. The public projected their own fantasies of the perfect daughter onto her. She was America's sweetheart, safe, non-threatening, and eternally wholesome. But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. The transition from a normal teenager to a national icon is traumatic, and Dana had no coping mechanisms. She had never been allowed to develop them. While other teenagers were experimenting with rebellion in the relative safety of their high schools and suburban basements, the cast of Diff'rent Strokes was experimenting with adulthood in the backlots of Hollywood and the VIP rooms of clubs they were too young to enter. The isolation was profound. They couldn't go to the mall without being mobbed. They couldn't make friends who didn't want something from them. The only way to numb the anxiety, the exhaustion of a 14-hour workday, and the crushing weight of expectation was to escape. It started innocently enough, a beer here, a joint there. But in the late 70s and early 80s, Hollywood was awash in cocaine. It was everywhere, as common as coffee on set. For a young girl like Dana, who was desperate to fit in, desperate to be seen as an adult by the cool kids, and desperate to silence the voice of her mother in her head, the drugs were a revelation. They made her feel confident. They made her feel powerful. They took away the fear. By the time she was 15, Dana was using cocaine regularly. She wasn't partying like a rock star. She was medicating like a trauma victim. She would show up to set, smile for the cameras, deliver her lines with that trademark sparkle, and then retreat to her dressing room to get high. It was a secret life, hidden behind the blinding wattage of her public persona. However, the drugs were a symptom, not the disease. The real disease was the industry's perception of her. In Hollywood, a child star is a perishable good. They are like milk. They have an expiration date printed on their foreheads. Gary Coleman, due to his medical condition that stunned his growth, could play a child indefinitely. He was the eternal kid, the mascot of the show. But Dana was subject to the laws of biology. She was growing up, her body was changing, she was becoming a woman. And to the producers of Diff'rent Strokes, a woman was not what they had paid for. They had paid for a little girl. Every inch she grew, every curve she developed was a threat to the brand. They bound her chest to make her look younger. They dressed her in childish clothes that became increasingly ridiculous as she aged. They were trying to freeze her in time, to fight nature itself, to protect their ratings. Dana could feel the shift. She could feel the producer's eyes on her. Critical and cold, she wasn't the cute little girl anymore. She was a problem to be solved. The scripts started to sideline her. The jokes were all for Gary. She was becoming set dressing. And as her value to the show diminished, so did the protection they offered her. She was walking a tightrope, balancing the demands of her mother, the demands of the studio, and her own desperate need to grow up, all while looking down into the abyss of irrelevance. She didn't know it yet, but the clock was ticking. The disposable star was nearing her expiration date, and the machinery of Hollywood was already gearing up to throw her away. The year 1984 arrived with the promise of Orwellian dystopia in literature, but for Dana Plato, it was supposed to be the year of her liberation. She was 20 years old, an age that in the real world signifies the exciting threshold of adulthood, independence, and self-discovery. But in the artificial ecosystem of Metro Media Square, 20 was a dangerous number. It was the age where the illusion of childhood began to crack under the strain of biology. Dana was living a double life. On screen, she was still Kimberly Drummond, the virginal high school-age daughter who fretted about prom dates and curfews. Off screen, She was a young woman with adult desires, adult problems, and a desperate need to break free from the suffocating good girl persona that had been stapled to her soul for 6 years. It was in this volatile period that she fell in love with Lanny Lambert. Lanny was a rock musician, a guitarist, a man who represented everything the clean-cut world of Diff'rent Strokes was not. To Florine Plato, he was a threat, a corruption. To the producers, he was a distraction. But to Dana, he was reality. He was someone who saw her not as a paycheck or a character, but as a woman. For the first time in her life, she felt a connection that wasn't scripted. And then the inevitable happened. Dana discovered she was pregnant. In any other profession, in any other life, a pregnancy at 20, while perhaps unplanned, would be a milestone. It is a moment of profound transformation, a biological imperative that signals the beginning of a new generation. Dana was ecstatic. She naively believed that her family at NBC would share in her joy. After all, they had watched her grow up. They had been there for her birthdays, her graduations, her triumphs. She convinced herself that the show would adapt to her reality. Kimberly Drummond could grow up, she could get married, she could have a baby. It would be a natural evolution, a way to breathe new life into a sitcom that was already showing signs of age. She walked into the meeting with the producers with a heart full of hope, expecting congratulations. What she received instead was a termination notice. The meeting was cold, clinical, and devastatingly brief. The executives looked at the swelling belly of their star and didn't see a miracle of life. They saw a breach of contract. They saw a brand violation. To them, Kimberly Drummond was a commodity, and her value was inextricably linked to her chastity. A pregnant Kimberly shattered the fantasy. It forced the audience to acknowledge that the little girl they loved had had sex. It was off-brand. The hypocrisy of the moment was staggering. At the very same time Dana was being scrutinized for her pregnancy, her co-star Todd Bridges was embroiled in serious legal troubles involving weapons and drugs. Gary Coleman was gaining a reputation for being difficult and litigious, but they were male, and more importantly, they were still funny. They still fit the visual gag. They were protected by the studio shield. Dana, however, had committed the unforgivable sin of female adolescence. She had become a mother. The producers decided that Kimberly Drummond could not be pregnant, and therefore Dana Plato could no longer be Kimberly Drummond. There was no negotiation. There was no offer to hide the pregnancy behind large coats or potted plants, a common trick in sitcom history. They simply cut her loose. The rejection was absolute. They didn't just fire her, they erased her. There was no tearful farewell episode. Kimberly didn't go off to the Peace Corps or an Ivy League university. She just vanished from the Drummond penthouse, a ghost in the machine. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be overstated. For a young woman whose entire sense of self-worth had been constructed around the approval of these authority figures, being discarded was a psychic wound from which she would never recover. She had been a good girl for 20 years. She had followed the rules. She had smiled when she was sad, worked when she was sick, and kept the secrets of the set hidden. And her reward was abandonment. It reinforced the darkest lesson of her childhood. She was only lovable as long as she was useful. Now that she was damaged goods, she was trash. The aftermath of the firing was a slow-motion car crash. Dana tried to pivot. She married Lanny Lambert in April 1984, trying to build a domestic sanctuary to replace the professional one she had lost. When her son, Tyler Edward Lambert, was born in July, Dana poured all her displaced energy into him. Tyler was the one thing she had produced that the studio couldn't edit or cancel. He was hers. For a brief, shimmering moment, it looked like Dana might survive the transition. She had money, or so she thought. She had a husband. She had a son. She could disappear into anonymity and live the normal life she had always been denied. But the plastic bubble had left her with zero immunity to the real world. She had no life skills. She didn't know how to balance a checkbook, how to vet an employee, or how to navigate a marriage without a director telling her how to feel. And the demons of addiction, which had been kept at bay by the rigorous schedule of the show, now had ample time to fester. The boredom of suburban life, combined with the lingering pain of rejection, led her back to the bottle and the bag. The drugs weren't just for fun anymore. They were a necessity to silence the voice in her head that kept asking, "Who are you if you aren't Kimberly?" Then came 1988. If tragedies have a tipping point, a singularity where gravity becomes too strong to escape, for Dana Plato, it was 1988. In the span of a single hellish week, the floor dropped out of her universe. It began with the death of Florine Plato. For all her controlling, smothering tendencies, Florine was the only anchor Dana had ever known. She was the manager, the mother, the gatekeeper. When Florine died of scleroderma, a painful and wasting autoimmune disease, Dana was left untethered. The complicated grief, mourning a woman she both loved and resented, was overwhelming. But before she could even process the loss, her marriage collapsed. Lanny Lambert filed for divorce. The domestic sanctuary she had tried to build turned out to be a house of cards. And then the final, crushing blow, the money. Dana had worked for over a decade in one of the most lucrative industries on earth. She had been a top-tier star on a top-tier show. She estimated her fortune to be somewhere around $11 million, a nest egg that should have secured her and Tyler for life. In the wake of her mother's death and her divorce, she went to examine her finances, planning to liquidate assets to start over. She opened the books and found nothing. The accountant who had been hired to manage her funds, a man her mother had trusted implicitly, had been systematically looting her accounts for years. He hadn't just skimmed off the top, he had hollowed her out. Of the millions she had earned, less than $150,000 remained. $11 million. Gone. Stolen by a man in a suit who viewed her not as a client, but as a foolish little girl who wouldn't notice. It was a theft of staggering proportions, but because it was white-collar crime, it lacked the visceral horror of a robbery at gunpoint. Yet it was far more violent. It stripped her of her security, her future, and her power. Imagine the position she was in. She was 24 years old. She was a single mother. She had no resume, no college degree, and no practical skills. The only industry she knew had blacklisted her. And now she was broke. The sheer panic of that realization, the physiological terror of looking at a bank balance and realizing you cannot feed your child, is the engine that drove the rest of her tragic life. This wasn't a celebrity behaving badly. This was a desperate mother facing the abyss. This is the moment where desperation took the wheel. When you are drowning, you don't look for a luxury yacht. You grab the nearest piece of driftwood, even if it's covered in rot. Dana tried to save herself the only way she knew how, by monetizing her fame and her body. In 1989, she made a decision that she thought was calculated, but which the world viewed as pathetic. She agreed to pose for Playboy. Her logic was heartbreakingly simple. She thought, if I do this, I will kill Kimberly Drummond. I will prove to the casting directors that I am a woman. I am sexy. I have an edge. I can play the femme fatale, the bad girl, the adult. She saw it as a rebranding strategy. She posed for a pictorial titled Diff'rent Strokes, Dana Plato, Primetime Virgin No More. It backfired spectacularly. The public didn't see a liberated woman taking control of her sexuality. They saw a tragedy. They saw their little sister taking her clothes off for money. It felt voyeuristic and sad. Instead of opening doors to serious dramatic roles, the Playboy spread slammed them shut. It cemented her image in the public imagination not as an adult actress, but as a fallen star. It moved her from the A-list to the D-list in a single month. The industry sneered. They saw it as an act of desperation, and in Hollywood, desperation is a repellent. But the Playboy money was a temporary bandage on a hemorrhage. The real war was being fought in family court. Lanny Lambert, armed with better lawyers and the narrative of Dana's instability, went for full custody of Tyler. He used her poverty against her. He used the Playboy photos against her. He argued that a woman who posed nude and had a history of drug use was unfit to be a mother. It was a cruel irony. She had posed nude to get money to support her son, and that very act was used to take him away. In a decision that would haunt her until her final breath, Dana lost primary custody of Tyler. She was granted visitation rights, but the boy, the center of her gravity, the only person who loved her unconditionally, was now living in another state, raised by his father. This was the breaking point. You can survive bankruptcy. You can survive divorce. You can survive the death of a parent. But for a mother to lose her child because she lacks the funds to fight for him is a spiritual amputation. It broke her. Following the loss of Tyler, Dana entered a fugue state of drift. She moved to Las Vegas in 1990. It was the perfect setting for her unraveling. Las Vegas is a city of illusions, a place where people go to reinvent themselves or to disappear. Dana did both. She was trying to outrun her fame, but she was also trapped by it. She needed money, so she took jobs that were humiliatingly public. She worked at a dry cleaner's counter. Picture the scene. A customer walks in to pick up his pressed shirts. The bell on the door jingles. The woman behind the counter turns around. She looks familiar. The customer squints. "Hey," he says, didn't you used to be on TV? Dana would have to smile, that trained reflex smile, and say, "Yes, that was me." The customer would take his shirts, leaving a tip and a look of pity that felt like acid. Every day was a reminder of how far she had fallen. She wasn't just broke, she was a public spectacle of failure. By 1991, the isolation was total. She was living in a chaotic apartment in Vegas, surrounded by hangers-on and drug dealers who were drawn to the fading heat of her celebrity. The money from the Playboy shoot was gone. The residuals from Diff'rent Strokes had dried up. She was drinking heavily to numb the pain of missing Tyler. She was taking Valium to sleep and painkillers to wake up. The plastic bubble was long gone, replaced by a glass cage of addiction. She was trapped, visible to everyone but touched by no one. And then came the night of February 28th, 1991, the night of the video store. When we look back at the robbery, it is essential to view it through the lens of mental health, not criminality. A professional robber wears a mask. A professional robber scouts the location. A professional robber does not rob a store 5 minutes from their own apartment. And a professional robber certainly does not rob a place where they are likely to be recognized by the clerk. Dana's actions that night were not about the money. $164 could not solve her problems. It couldn't buy her a house. It couldn't get Tyler back. It couldn't even buy a plane ticket. The robbery was a performance art piece of despair. It was a cry for help amplified by a megaphone. Subconsciously, she wanted to be stopped. She wanted the police to come. She wanted the system to intervene because she could no longer manage her own life. She wanted to be arrested because in jail, at least, someone tells you when to eat and when to sleep. In jail, you don't have to make decisions. When the police caught her just minutes later, because she had barely tried to escape, she was docile. She was confused. When the mugshot was taken, she looked like a frightened deer. But the media didn't see the fear. They saw the headline. Diff'rent Strokes, star arrested. It was the lead story on the news. Wayne Newton, the Las Vegas legend, posted her $13,000 bail. It was a final surreal indignity. She was a charity case for other celebrities, a cautionary tale for the industry to gawk at. The judge was lenient, sentencing her to 5 years of probation. But probation is a trap for an addict. It requires stability, routine, and sobriety, 3 things Dana did not possess. In 1992, she violated her probation by forging a prescription for Valium. She was arrested again. This time, she went to jail for 30 days. Dana Plato, the girl who had once had a limousine driver to take her to the studio, was now wearing an orange jumpsuit, sitting in a concrete cell, going through withdrawal. The fall was complete, but the bottom hadn't been reached. The tragedy of Dana Plato is that she kept surviving the falls, only to find a new ledge to drop from. She spent the 90s in a blur of rehab stints, failed comebacks, and abusive relationships. She was stripped of her dignity layer by layer. The industry that had made millions off her smile now refused to even acknowledge her existence except to mock her. She was a punchline on late-night talk shows, a trivia answer, a "Where Are They Now" segment designed to make the audience feel superior. But through it all, she kept trying. That is the most heartbreaking part. She didn't give up. She kept trying to get sober. She kept trying to get work. She kept trying to be a mother to Tyler from afar. She was fighting a war against an entire culture that wanted her to fail, and she was fighting it alone, armed only with the fragile tools of a childhood that had never allowed her to grow up. As the millennium approached, she would make one last desperate attempt to reclaim her narrative, an attempt that would lead her into the lion's den of shock radio, and ultimately to her final resting place in a sweltering RV in Oklahoma. The late 1990s were a cruel era for the fallen. The culture had shifted from the earnestness of the 80s to a jagged, cynical irony. It was the age of Jerry Springer, of tabloid talk shows, of shock jock radio. Empathy was out. Spectacle was in. And Dana Plato, living on the fringes of society, was prime content for this meat grinder. By 1999, at the age of 34, Dana had retreated from the bright lights of Los Angeles. She was living a nomadic existence, residing in a Winnebago, a recreational vehicle, parked in a trailer park in Menifee, California. It was a stark, dusty reality, 1,000,000 miles away from the penthouse set of Diff'rent Strokes. She was engaged to Robert Menchaca, a man significantly younger than her, an aspiring manager who lived with her in the cramped confines of the RV. To the outside world, it looked like rock bottom, but Dana was trying to spin it as a simple bohemian life. She told people she was happy. She told people she was clean. She told people she was ready for a comeback. But the industry wasn't interested in her acting talent anymore. They were only interested in her tragedy. In May 1999, Dana agreed to appear on The Howard Stern Show. At the time, Stern was the undisputed king of radio, a man whose empire was built on pushing boundaries and mocking the sacred. His show was a coliseum where celebrities, particularly those on the D-list, were thrown to the lions for the amusement of millions. Dana's friends warned her. They told her it was a trap. They told her she wasn't strong enough to handle the Shark Tank. But Dana was desperate. She needed the publicity. She needed to rewrite the narrative. She believed with a heartbreaking naivety that she could walk into that studio, tell her truth, and win people over. She wanted to look the world in the eye and say, "I survived." On the morning of May 7th, 1999, Dana walked into the studio in New York. She looked fragile. The years of stress and substance abuse had etched lines onto her face, but she still had that spark, that desperate desire to please. The interview began cordially enough. Dana spoke about her life in the RV, about her struggles with money, and about her past mistakes. She insisted repeatedly and with great intensity that she was sober. She said she had been clean for over a decade, with only minor slip-ups. She wanted to be seen as a survivor, a woman who had conquered her demons. But the format of the show included listener calls. And when the phone lines were open, the floodgates of cruelty burst open. The callers were vicious. They didn't see a human being in pain. They saw a punching bag. They smelled blood in the water. One caller after another attacked her. "You sound stoned," a voice crackled over the airwaves. "You're a burnout," said another. "Did you blow all your money on drugs?" They mocked her speech, her appearance, her life choices. It was a public stoning, broadcast live. Dana tried to defend herself. Her voice wavered. She laughed nervously, trying to deflect the insults with the same good girl politeness she had been taught as a child. She kept saying, "I'm clean, I swear, I'm clean." But the more she protested, the more the callers pushed. The atmosphere in the studio was suffocating. Then came the ultimate humiliation. In response to the accusations that she was high on air, Stern and his team pressured her to prove it. They asked for a drug test, right there, on the spot. They wanted to cut off a lock of her hair to send to a lab. Imagine the psychology of that moment. A 34-year-old woman, a former icon, being bullied into submitting biological evidence of her sobriety to a radio host for entertainment. A person with boundaries would have walked out. A person with a sense of protection would have told them to go to hell. But Dana Plato had no boundaries. She had spent her life saying yes to producers. She agreed. She let them take a sample of her hair. It was an act of total submission, a desperate gamble to buy a shred of credibility. She left the studio shortly after, looking defeated. She had exposed her throat to the world, hoping for a caress, and the world had bitten her. The next day, May 8th, 1999, was the day before Mother's Day. Dana and Robert Menchaca were in their RV, driving through the flat, endless plains of Oklahoma. They were on their way to visit Robert's parents. The interview had drained the last reserves of Dana's emotional energy. She was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that sleep couldn't fix. The humiliation of the previous day was playing on a loop in her mind. The voices of the callers, the sneers, the demand for her hair, it all swirled together into a deafening noise of rejection. They stopped the RV outside Robert's mother's house in Moore, Oklahoma. It was hot. The air was thick and heavy. Dana complained that she didn't feel well. She said she needed to lie down. She retreated to the back of the RV, the small stifling box that was her home. She needed the noise to stop. She needed to sleep. She reached for her pill bottles. She took Lortab, a powerful opioid painkiller. She took Soma, a muscle relaxant known for its sedative effects. This combination, often called a Vegas cocktail, is notoriously dangerous. Did she intend to die? It is the question that has haunted her story for decades. The coroner would later rule it a suicide, citing the lethal levels of drugs in her system. They argued that a woman with her history knew exactly what that dosage would do. But those who knew her best, including her former co-star Todd Bridges, believe otherwise. They believe it was an accident. They argue that Dana didn't want to die, she just wanted a break. She wanted to turn off the lights in her brain for a few hours. She was an addict in pain, treating her emotional wounds with the only medicine she knew. She wasn't trying to end her life. She was trying to survive the afternoon. Robert checked on her later that day. She was snoring loudly, a common side effect of deep sedation and respiratory distress. He thought she was just sleeping it off. He left her alone. When he returned the hours later, the snoring had stopped. The silence in the RV was absolute. Dana Plato was not breathing. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. The girl who had lit up the room, the girl who had been America's little sister, was pronounced dead in a trailer park in Oklahoma. She was 34 years old. The news of her death rippled through the media, but the tone was less mournful than it was judgmental. Child star dies of overdose. Tragic end for Diff'rent Strokes actress. It was treated as an inevitability, the final act of a script that had been written the moment she was fired from the show. But the tragedy of Dana Plato didn't end with her breath. The curse of the disposable star is radioactive. It has a half-life that destroys everything in its orbit. And the person closest to the blast zone was her son, Tyler Lambert. Tyler was 14 years old when his mother died. He was the boy who had been the cause of her firing, the boy she had fought for, lost and loved from a distance. He had grown up watching his mother disintegrate in slow motion. He had seen the mugshots, the headlines, the pain. He blamed Hollywood for killing her. He blamed the industry that had chewed her up. He inherited her features, her wide eyes, her smile, but he also inherited her trauma. Tyler tried to break the cycle. He didn't want to be an actor. He wanted to be a cameraman. He wanted to be on the other side of the lens, the one in control. But the grief was a heavy coat that he couldn't take off. He struggled with his own substance abuse issues, mirroring the mother he missed so desperately. He lived in the shadow of her ghost, constantly reminded of her every time he looked in the mirror or turned on the TV and saw a rerun of Diff'rent Strokes. On May 6, 2010, almost exactly 11 years after Dana died, and just 2 days before Mother's Day, Tyler Lambert made his final decision. He was 25 years old. He picked up a shotgun. He didn't leave a note explaining the philosophy of his pain. He simply ended it. His grandmother, Dana's former mother-in-law, summed up the tragedy with a sentence that is as simple as it is devastating. Tyler wanted to be with his mother. The bullet that killed Tyler Lambert was fired in 1984, the day Dana Plato was fired for being pregnant. It just took 26 years to hit his target. The story of Dana Plato is not a morality play about the dangers of drugs. That is too easy. That lets us off the hook. The story of Dana Plato is an indictment of a culture that consumes youth like a natural resource. We loved Kimberly Drummond, but we didn't care about Dana Plato. We wanted the image, the smile, the fantasy, and when the human being behind the image became inconvenient, when she grew up, when she bled, when she struggled, we didn't just look away, we threw her away. She was the original disposable star. She was a pioneer in a terrifying new category of celebrity, the famous person with no money, no protection, and no future, forced to cannibalize their own dignity to survive. We see her echoes today in every child star who spirals out on social media, in every young influencer who burns out before they can legally drink. We watch them fall, and we click the link, and we judge. But we rarely ask who built the ledge they are standing on. Dana Plato died trying to prove she was worth something. She died trying to convince a radio host that she was a good person. But she didn't need to prove anything. She was a mother who loved her son. She was an artist who lost her canvas. She was a skater who lost her ice. In the end, the most tragic thing about Dana Plato's life is not that she died young. It is that she spent her entire life in a crowded room, screaming to be heard, and the only time we really listened was when she whispered goodbye.